all the way till today, the questions and conflagration that blew up about what was known as the Satanic Panic resulted from a lot of disinformation and a lack of awareness of how to counteract media interest. The concept that happened when in that time frame, and this is a bit divergent, but I'm going to definitely answer Gabi's question here. The period was rife with concern that parents had for the development of the human psyche. The school systems were starting to be aware, if you will, of the challenges that outside influences could have on the individual, and they started to be concerned with before Dungeons and Dragons. The Satanic Panic aspect was also involved with rock and roll music, with imagery. Artists were sometimes challenged for their influence, whatever influenced them to create the art that they had. The novelists were challenged. The entire environment was concerned with what impact things had on people. TV had become a force, right? When I was very young, when TV first were rolled out and such, we had a TV when I was small, but it was a black and white. It was relatively small. Because of that conflab, that whole confusion about what should influence us, it hit all the markets at the same time. When I was a kid, for example, there were cartoons that were out that today simply are kind of looked down upon and stuff, going all the way back to Bugs Bunny Roadrunner Hour. Now, granted, there's a lot more we could unpack when we're talking about those environments, because there were all kinds of double entendre. There were a lot of racially charged things that were not there when they were created, or were not visible when they were created, and later became a problem culturally. But those things that were all about. To me, the issue is that they were all about something called the benefit of the doubt. We hold culture responsible for things that are also familially responsible. So in the case of the Satanic Panic aspect of the world at that point, everyone was concerned with whether or not individuals and children can become influenced by an outside force to do terrible, horrible things. Now, in the specific case, there was a book that was released, and it was about the story of a player by the name of Dallas Egbert, I think, and literally I think that was his name. But this young man had issues and had committed, I believe he attempted suicide, and was out of contact with his family for a time, and it was a mess. And so she hired a professional investigator to go find out what happened with her son and such. And so that development, or that cause, blossomed and exploded to the point where people were concerned that if you played a role-play game, you might be led into issues concerning Satanism. Now, for clarity, the very concept of a role-play game is intended to be a hero's journey, where the players in the story take on the role of individuals who are growing and progressing towards the point where they can actually become heroic paragons and be involved in the kinds of stories that we had read when we were kids about the Greek gods and the Greek champions, Hercules and Perseus, and all these different champions of the past, which were captured in lore, and even in certain cases had been captured in religious allegory, were developed. And add to that the fact there was a fascination at the time with the the orders of the knights, and there was still some small controversy and challenge with things like the Salem witch trials and such. And so there was a to lack of a better term, it was kind of a perfect storm to go after role play, because it was the only place where the person who was participating was confronting what was perceived to be evil things, was actually facing those evil things. And so parents were concerned when they heard their children say, yes, we had an engagement last night and we took on Baphomet, or we took on some great historical evil. And the parents were concerned, well, is my son capable of handling that or whatever? So now, in my case, as a game master with a Christian background, it was kind of an interesting dynamic, because involved with my church community, I was also a leader of my role play groups, and there was a conflict. And at times, it got a little interesting. And so my experience with it was I had to do some serious biblical study on my part in order to defend my ability to play role play games, not to my parents were perfectly fine with it, but to the preacher and the families who knew the kids that were playing with me, and they were concerned. So I became fundamentally, in the time, and this was in a very minor scale, I lived in Kansas after all, and only had a few different communities that I was a part of. Now, I moved a lot. I moved 40 times before I was 18. I went to 22 different grade schools and 6 different high schools across the 11 states. So I was everywhere, so to speak, in the Midwest, and lived in places from Illinois all the way to Arizona. So I lived all over that area. And each time I moved and got involved with the community, they would eventually find out, oh, he's a role player. Oh, and I was also leader in my Bible classes, because my understanding of the way Scripture works made it so I could actually defend myself, so to speak. And so I became, for a period of time, somewhat of a localized apologist. And I have no idea whether anybody would remember any of this, because this was so long ago. This was in the like I said, in the late 70s, early 80s, but actually mid 70s to early 80s. That entire period, I was actively defending the game in the context of others. And in another video, I will... Yes, I can hear you now, Gene. You're hearing me twice, Gene, because you still have the voice turned on the Discord channel. And you have to have it there, but you have to shut it off here on Twitch.
How do I shut it off?
Go to the Twitch image, down at the bottom. Just slide down to the bottom of the picture. There's a little trumpet, and you just click the little X beside it. So, anyway, so the dynamic of dealing with role-play games as a player and as a member of a church community, it was quite fun, because in those cases, I would actually be brought up on a say a Sunday or a Saturday afternoon, and that Saturday they would bring together their concerned families or whatever, and we would actually have sort of like a little debate. I would stand at one lectern, and the preacher would stand at his lectern, and the two of them would, I and they would go back and forth. And the fundamental defense, I'll tell you, the fundamental defense for me of role-play games is the fact that Jesus' lessons that he taught were all done in an allegorical parable form, and all of them considered the person who was listening to them to consider all of the options that were being provided in the situation and make decisions. And that is what is the essence of role play. So, therefore, conjecturally, it is actually a role-playing game master's obligation to be telling a forthright story, and using the players as the exemplars of the characters in that story. In terms of responsiveness, in many cases, we would actually be able to start by games groups within the congregation. I actually had games groups that included preachers and youth pastors and such that would come and play in my game because they wanted to be able to use that tool in their own process. Now, the Satanic Panic argument, the biggest challenge to it is the second half of that, and that is that they felt that a game master with a group of kids in an unbridled condition would actually somehow summon up or bring into fruition actual demonic forces. My response and my answer to that, and I believe is empirically the same as it is in biblical references, is the story of Elijah. And in the time of Elijah, there was an evil king, Ahab, and in that case, Gene, just shut off one or the other. Just shut off the Twitch. You won't physically have to watch the screen. Just turn off, just minimize the window, and then you can just talk to me on the Discord. Sorry you're having trouble with that. And it's almost comedy that we're having that conversation while we're having this other one. In that time period, Elijah was challenged. The king Ahab wanted him to cease preaching about God and wanted instead to have his priests of a second religion, known as the priests of Baal, take over the things, and he felt that Baal was a greater god than the God of Elijah. So Elijah said, let's set up a test. And to me, this discussion is exactly what fundamentally should happen in any case you want to test one faith against another. By all means, do this, except for the whole blood ritual thing. That's actually was required by the Judaistic law at the time. But they would do their challenge by each of them creating an altar, one to the God of Elijah, Yahweh, Jehovah, and the other one would be an altar built for Baal. And they would take similar animals for the sacrifice, and I'm not talking about advocating animal sacrifice. I'm just saying that this is what they did in the time. Each of them would prepare a calf. Each one would that's true. That's true, Jim. So they would prepare the two altars, prepare the two calves, and they would each perform a ritual, and whichever god responded would be the god that should be followed. Simple test. Equal amount of time, equal sacrifices, equal everything, and see which god would respond. Now, so Elijah was beneficent and said, "You guys go first." And so the priests of Baal brought out their animal, sacrificed it, put it on the altar, and began praying fervently over it for Baal to show up and accept the sacrifice, to consume it or whatever. And the funny thing about that story is that Elijah was rather snarky. I love the fact that he shows a bit of attitude here as they're beginning their ritual, because he starts saying things like, well, maybe you're not shouting loud enough. I hear you calling out, but perhaps your God has gone on a far journey and is far, far away. Maybe you should scream louder. And they were doing that, and he goes, oh, well, maybe your dance isn't fervent enough. You should maybe be dancing around. And so they began dancing around and being frenetic. And finally he says, maybe you should help with the sacrifice by bleeding on the altar yourself, sharing your blood, showing how earnest your pleas are. And so they started doing that. They were actually cutting themselves and bleeding on it. And finally Ahab was like, okay, they were so frustrated they hadn't accomplished anything. So Elijah comes up and he takes one look at the altar and says, this isn't fair. He says, this is not fair. We've got two altars, but mine needs to be, let's give it more of a challenge. And again, his snarkiness comes through this. He says, let's build a trench, a trench around mine. And then let's pour water on all of the firewood and all of the animal. And let's just soak the entire place down. We just want... And he filled it until the water around the outside was completely filled up with water. And so as he's sitting there getting ready for his preparation, they've now soaked his wood until the water is running out and filling the trench, and the place is just doused. And so it says that he simply kneeled to the ground, raised his hands to heaven, and said, God, this is for you. This is your sacrifice. And immediately out of the heavens comes this, basically a beam of fire, and it consumes the animal, and it consumes the firewood, and it consumes the water, and it just completely obliterates the space. Just completely consumes it all. And of course, the clear, obvious winner of this contest was Yahweh, Jehovah, God of Elijah, over these priests of Baal. Now, here's my posit. Here's where this all comes down to. If I am a game master, sitting in a basement, an amateur, even if I really want to, can I and 3 amateurs summon forth anything when 40 priests of Baal, bleeding all over an altar, professionals at their career, couldn't do it? I posit to you the theory that no, it simply can't happen because, after all, it's a freaking game! We are just playing a game. We are telling a story. That's all we're doing. We are relating details together to create a collective consciousness experiment in the imaginary world. And it has nothing to do physically with this world, but the power of that imagination, the ability to utilize that imagination to handle our other problems by, in like fashion, imagining, is the key. We need to be able to do that.